The Honourable Leader of the Opposition. When the Prime Minister inflates the price of groceries and forces 28,000 young Quebecers to write to Santa Claus for food rather than presents, he spends $1 billion on a scandalous green fund, the officials of which are saying that money is thrown for free to friends and wasted. And now a whistleblower said, and I quote, that the minister lied to the committee about this scandal. Why did this minister hide the scandal? The Right Honourable Prime Minister. Mr. Speaker, the Conservative leader's plan that seeks to close Parliament last week failed. All it served to do was show the true colours of the Conservatives. It cost $2 million to Canadian taxpayers. The Conservative Party tried to reduce access to affordable childcare services, reduce the construction of affordable housing, and cut in the budgets of policing and military bodies. They want to bring us back to the Stone Age. We, on our side, will meet the needs of Canadians. The Honourable Leader of the Opposition.
Mr. Speaker, the question was about the Prime Minister's $1 billion green slush fund scandal. We already know, while he forces 2 million Canadians to a food bank and doubled housing costs, is quadrupling the carbon tax, he has a $1 billion fund whose own bureaucrats say reminds them of the sponsorship scandal, whose executives give money to their own companies. Yesterday, a courageous whistleblower testified the Prime Minister's Innovation Minister lied, and I quote, lied to the committee. Why is this minister and his boss, the Prime Minister, covering up this scandal and waste of Canadian tax dollars?
The Right Honourable Prime Minister.
It's not surprising that the Conservative leader doesn't want to talk about his failed Republican-style plan to shut down Parliament last week. His 30-hour temper tantrum achieved was to show Canadians the party's true colours and cost Canadians $2 million in wasteful spending. The Conservative Party tried to cut affordable childcare, cut construction of affordable housing, and defund the police and Canada's armed forces. While they want to bring us back to the Stone Age, we'll stay focused on Canadians.
The Honourable Leader of the Opposition.
Canadians are forced to eat stone soup this winter after this Prime Minister gave us the worst food price inflation in 40 years, and we have 2 million Canadians, a record-smashing number, lined up at food banks. I know the Prime Minister is desperate to avoid defending his own track record, or worse yet, his quadrupling of the carbon tax. There is a common-sense Conservative bill, C-234, in the Senate up for the vote today. Will the Prime Minister stop blocking the bill, axe the tax so that our farmers can feed families?
The Right Honourable Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, the Conservative Party of Canada had the opportunity to support affordability measures for Canadians, but instead they chose to take 30 hours attacking the most vulnerable. During the Conservative leader's $2 million temper tantrum, they gladly stood against veterans experiencing homelessness, against emergency shelters for women and girls, against Indigenous housing, against rapid affordable housing construction. They even tried to prevent support for those who lost their homes in Hurricane Fiona. That leader is reckless and should be ashamed.
The Honourable Leader of the Opposition.
The truth is that the Prime Minister is not spending money on any of those things. He has a food program that doesn't feed kids, it feeds bureaucracies and creates frameworks that kids can't eat. He has a housing affordability program that doubles the cost of housing, a housing accelerator that hasn't built a single house, a carbon tax that hasn't reduced emissions. So instead of spending billions on programs that cause inflation and do nothing but sound pretty, why won't he axe the tax on our farmers so that they can feed Canadians this winter?
The Right Honourable Prime Minister.
Whether the leader of the Opposition makes a homemade video about it or not, a key factor contributing to food inflation around the world is Putin's illegal war in Ukraine. That party has been playing right into the Kremlin's hands by voting against Operation Unifier, by voting against funding for military aid to Ukraine, and by voting at every opportunity, including again this morning, against the Canada-U-Trade free trade agreement that Ukrainians have been asking for. We will never abandon Ukraine, unlike the Conservative leader who's shown Canadians.
The Honourable Leader of the Opposition.
The Prime Minister is desperate to distract from the misery that he caused here at home. I wonder if he could just for once think about Canadians instead of thinking about himself. We have 2 million Canadians lined up in food banks, a record-smashing number. He's doubled the cost of housing. He wants to quadruple the carbon tax. 9 in 10 young people say they'll never be able to afford a home. We understand with this miserable record, he doesn't want to talk about Canada or Canadians. He'd rather spread falsehood about faraway foreign lands, Mr. Speaker. Will he not stand up for once for Canada, axe the tax so our families can eat?
The Right Honourable Prime Minister.
Speaker, the Conservative leaders' partisan vitriol and performance games are hurting Canadians. Let's talk about their record directly. When it came to 988, the Suicide Crisis Helpline, how did they just vote? Against. When it came to the Lac-Mégantic rail bypass, how did they vote against? Against. When it came to the new Montreal Holocaust Museum on the first night of Hanukkah, how did they vote? Against. Mr. Speaker, there is clearly nothing this Conservative leader won't compromise.
Order. The Honourable Member for Bailleul-Chambly. I sought to understand the government's new dental program. It's not an easy one. We have 3 types of dental programs. A private one for those who have money, the federal program, and then Quebec's program. But there is one single jurisdiction, and that is Quebec's jurisdiction over healthcare. It's easy to explain what is clear. The Liberal government is throwing sweets and candy to the NDP to try and keep its government alive. Can the Prime Minister explain to us at least his dental program once and for all and make it clear? The Right Honourable Prime Minister. Well, it's rather bizarre, Mr. Speaker, because the leader of the Bloc Québécois is talking about sweets and candy, and we're trying to fight against that with a dental program. We have a plan that will help from coast to coast to coast, help families who cannot currently send their children to dentists. And next year we'll be here also for seniors with dental care. We'll be here for those under 18 who need dental care and who can't pay for it. And eventually we will cover absolutely every Canadian who cannot pay for their dental care, because we know that mouth health is general health, and we're here to help families. The Honourable Member for Bailleul-Chambly. That's what we were being told when we were in grade 8. About dental plans, but I understand that this is a difficult to explain program. A program was announced. The program was poorly drafted. Now, this is surprising from the NDP. It's a program that is great for the private sector. It also harms Quebec, which is of no surprise to anyone. When the Prime Minister authorized the dental program, did he keep in mind the health of Canadians or the financial health of his alliance with the NDP? The Right Honourable Prime Minister. Mr. Speaker, we recognise that far too many Canadians do not currently have access to dental care. We are a government that has always been here to invest in Canadians in order to help them. socially and economically, and we know that many families can't pay for dental care. And so they don't use dental care because they can't afford it. Now we're making sure that Canadians won't have to choose between dental care and groceries, for example, because we will be here to help them. That is something that counts for all Canadians. Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and we will be here for them, Mr. Speaker. The Honourable Member for Rosemont-la-Petite-Patrie. Mr. Speaker, to date, 20,000 Palestinian civilians have been killed in Gaza, half of whom are women and children. Despite this, the Liberals and the Conservatives refuse to demand a ceasefire. It's revolting. It's inhuman. The NDP continues to ask for a ceasefire and has done so for the past 2 months. Today, there's an important vote in the United Nations. We know that the Liberals have refused to listen to the families of those who have lost their family members, but perhaps they'll listen to their donors who are now abandoning them finally. At the United Nations today, Canada will vote for a ceasefire, yes or no? The Right Honourable Prime Minister. For the past 9 weeks, Mr. Speaker, the Government of Canada has had a responsible position that defends civilians, that seeks to establish a two-state solution with Israelis and Palestinians so that they can work and live safely in recognized countries. We will do everything in our power to continue to make sure that Canadians agree with one another, see eye to eye so we don't see hatred, Islamophobia, anti-Semitism. This government will continue to be here for everyone.
The Honourable Member from Edmonton Strathcona.
The Liberal position is appalling, not responsible. For 2 months, this government has sat and watched while 18,000 innocent civilians have lost their lives and have refused to call for a ceasefire. We need a ceasefire. We need the hostages removed. Last week, it was reported that Liberal donors were withholding support because of the moral failure of the Liberals. Today, there is an important vote at the United Nations. The Liberals have failed to listen to the Palestinian people and to Canadian Palestinians. Will they at least listen to their fundraisers and vote for a ceasefire today?
Yeah. Ceasefire!
The Right Honourable Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, since October 7th, we have recognized the terrorist attack by Hamas that killed well over 1,000 innocent Israelis, and we have recognized Israel's right to defend itself. But at the same time, the cost of justice cannot be the continued suffering of all Palestinian civilians. That is why we're continuing to put forward, including today, in a statement with Australia and New Zealand, a strong and clear Canadian position that we will continue to work with allies around the world on moving towards a two-state solution with peace for Israelis and peace for Palestinians living side by side.
The Honourable Member from Leeds, Grenville, Thousand Islands and Rideau Lakes.
There's been explosive testimony by a whistleblower on this Prime Minister's billion-dollar green slush fund that's seen $150 million misappropriated and gone to Liberal insiders. And senior NDP Liberal government officials have said there is no plan to get Canadians back. They're missing millions. After 8 years of this Prime Minister, it's clear that he's not worth that cost, and probably why he wouldn't even stick around. Will the Prime Minister shut down the slush fund and get Canadians back their money?
The Honourable Minister for Innovation.
Mr. Speaker, it is shocking but not surprising to see the Conservative ideology in full display, Mr. Speaker. Now what you're saying, Mr. Speaker, is that the Conservative are willing to attack anyone and any institution that would fight for climate change, Mr. Speaker, even institutions that have been voted by the Parliament in 2001, Mr. Speaker. Now what the Conservative are doing, they're calling the integrity into question of one of the top accounting firms in this country, Mr. Speaker. We will fight for Canadians, we will fight for climate change, and we'll restore governance in that institution.
The Honourable Member from Leeds, Grenville, Thousand Islands and Rideau Lakes.
On this side of the House, what we're doing is fighting Liberal corruption. We're going to keep doing that, even though this minister and his chief of staff, though they say it didn't happen, were briefed on what was going on at SCTC, but it was done orally so that they wouldn't be subject to ATIP rules. It's $150 missing million given outside the funding agreement, and we have 2 Liberal-appointed board members who are under investigation by the Ethics Commissioner. We have an Auditor General investigating investigation, and we have whistleblowers blowing the lid off this thing that shows that this minister and that prime minister don't have the courage to fight for Canadian tax dollars. Where are the missing millions? Who got rich?
The Honourable Minister for Innovation.
Mr. Speaker, on this side of the House, we will fight for Canadians every day, Mr. Speaker. Let's be very clear. What you're saying again, and for Canadians which are watching at home, don't be fooled. You're seeing conservative ideology to fight against anyone, any institution, even those they voted for in 2001, Mr. Speaker, to create in this House an institution that would fight for climate change, Mr. Speaker. We suspended the funding of the organization. We called for an investigation. The leadership has resigned. We'll get to the bottom of this, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Member from South Shore, St. Margaret's.
The minister won't tell us which Liberals got rich, and government officials last night admitted they were in every single board meeting where this happened in the Liberal Green Slush Fund. And according to the whistleblower, the former chair and directors took over $150 million of taxpayer money to their own companies. They were present, government officials were present during these meetings and allowed it to happen. So I'll ask the minister, why didn't he fire these corrupt Liberal directors?
The Honourable Minister.
Speaker, it's great to see my honourable colleague from Atlantic Canada stand up. I wish he stood up last week, and I wish he and his 7 other colleagues stood up last week. On this side of the House, we know the great work that the Atlantic Canada Opportunities Agency does for communities, for not-for-profits, for businesses. If he truly believed in the great work of ACOA, he would have done what his colleague from Caribou Prince George did, who abstained on his beliefs. So what's he going to say to the people of South Shore St. Margaret's and the 108 projects that ACOA funds in his riding? I'm going to tell them, we have your back.
The Honourable Member from South Shore, St. Margaret's.
Well, it's just not good enough that they won't deal with Liberal corruption at the Green Liberal Slush Fund. In fact, the minister took 35 months under his watch to suspend the Green Slush Fund when his own officials were in the meeting. And the whistleblower testified last night that the chair of the Green Slush Fund tried to get $2.2 million from the fund into her own vanity project, the Annette Basharian Centre, a direct conflict of interest. Since industry officials were in the meeting, why did the minister not fire this Liberal corrupt director the minute that happened?
The Honourable Minister for Innovation.
Mr. Speaker, we will take no lessons from the Conservative, Mr. Speaker. Just last week, Canadians have seen they have voted against CSIS, Mr. Speaker. They have voted against funding for affordable child care in this country, Mr. Speaker. They voted to cut Canadian dental care program, Mr. Speaker. On this side of the House, we'll stand for Canadian. We'll stand for growth, and we will continue to fight for Canadians at every step of the way, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Member for Mégantic-L'Érable. $150 million. $150 million in subsidies to Liberal friends from the $1 billion Liberal Green Slush Fund for months, despite the fact that its bureaucrats, its eyes and ears, went to meetings during which Liberal friends filled their pockets with cash. After 8 years of this Prime Minister, the cost is just not worth it. Instead of continuing to camouflage, can the Prime Minister let us know when we will get reimbursed for all this? The Honourable Minister. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, the Conservatives' favourite thing to do is to chop, chop, chop. Think about it, Mr. Speaker. Last week, the Conservative leader told his caucus, his extreme right caucus, to cut in the funding of search and rescue budgets. The Coast Guard that saves lives. 120 times the Conservatives had gone against Canadian values recently. Shame on them. The Honourable Member from Mégantic-L'Érable. Mr. Speaker, this costly NDP Liberal government learnt in May that Liberal friends that they had appointed to the Green Slush Fund had filled their pockets for their own interests. And what did the minister do? Absolutely nothing. Even worse, the minister, and I quote, lied according to a whistleblower before committee. He did nothing and more money was dispersed right into the pocket of Liberal friends after 8 years. This Prime Minister is simply not worth it. When will the Canadians finally get their money back? The Honourable Minister for Public Services and Procurement Canada. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Minister has answered this question very well already. What we don't know, Mr. Speaker, is why opposition MPs a few days ago voted against the dental plan that was announced. 30,000 people in his riding alone will be eligible by 2025 to this dental insurance, without which they would not be able to go to the dentist, which would create severe health problems. People often have to go to emergency units when they can't go to the dentist. Why is the Honourable Member betraying 30,000 people from his riding? The Honourable Member for Drummond. Mr. Speaker, you know when people are calling for your departure, it's probably not a good idea to go on a trip abroad. And yet, the CEO of Radio Canada, Catherine Tate, who announced the dismissal of 600 Radio Canada employees last Monday, has just left for Australia. I'm sure you'll agree, Mr. Speaker, that's quite a lack of judgment. Does the Minister for Canadian Heritage still have confidence in Catherine Tate, and does she approve Ms. Tate's decision to proceed with these layoffs? The Honourable Minister for Canadian Heritage. Mr. Speaker, the CEO of CBC Radio Canada's mandate will come to an end in 2025. In 2024, I will start a selection committee to find the best candidate for her replacement. A replacement for this indispensable organisation for Canadian democracy. On this side of the House, we believe in a strong public broadcaster that gives services to the Canadian population from coast to coast to coast in French, in English and Indigenous languages. We'll continue to defend our public broadcaster, Mr. Speaker. The Honourable Member for Drummond. In the last economic update, the government announced an increase in the tax credit for newsrooms from 25% to 35%, which isn't bad. And whilst it doesn't solve the media crisis, it does help, Mr. Speaker. We must admit it. Yes, it does help, but only print media. TV and radio journalists are unfortunately not eligible. As we can see, Bell Media, Québécois and Cogeco are also finding it difficult, as are all electronic media. Will the Minister make the tax credit for newsrooms available to digital media? The Honourable Minister for Canadian Heritage. Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I would like to first of all commend my colleague for the Bloc Québécois because he has always strongly defended newsrooms throughout our country and democracy in our country. Unfortunately, that is not the case for the Conservatives who are trying to destroy newsrooms. As my colleague knows, we updated the Broadcasting Act, which gives the CRTC the power to strengthen the framework for our TV and radio journalists who are having a bad time. It must be admitted the CRTC will also be able to decide whether it would be opportune or not to create a new fund to support newsrooms throughout Canada. We continue to work with the sector in order to fight against this crisis. The Honourable Member for Abitibi-Témiscamingue. The Liberals have abandoned victims of sexual misconduct in sports. They promised an independent public inquiry. That is what victims want. They want this independent public inquiry, but the Liberals backed down yesterday. They proposed a voluntary commission. A voluntary commission does not have the power to force federations or abusers to appear. A voluntary commission does not have the power to demand documents subpoenaed. A voluntary commission does not have the power to clean house, nor does it have the power to force changes within Sports Canada. Why are the Liberals protecting the federations instead of protecting victims? The Honourable Minister for Sports. Mr. Speaker, yes, we announced a commission on the future of sports in Canada. That comes from victim-centred trauma. We are going to study the future of sports in our country. My absolute priority, Mr. Speaker, are athletes, victims, survivors, and safe sports in Canada.
The honourable member from Dufferin-Caledon.
The Premier of the Northwest Territories wants to axe the tax. Other premiers are saying they will not collect the carbon tax, and First Nations are suing this government because of the carbon tax. We have a coast-to-coast-to-coast revolt against the carbon tax led by Conservatives, and as a result of the carbon tax, 40% more Ontarians have to use a food bank. Wow. This Liberal Prime Minister isn't worth the cost. Will he cancel his plans to quadruple the carbon tax on farmers, families, and First Nations for good?
The Honourable Minister for Natural Resources and Energy.
When this government came to power after 10 years of Stephen Harper and the member from Carleton, emissions in this country were projected to go up by 15% versus 2005 levels by 2030. Last week, we released the Emissions Reduction Plan update for Canada. What it shows is we have far exceeded the Harper target. We raised the target. We will achieve the interim objective in 2026. We will achieve the 2030 objective of 40% reduction. We have a climate plan that is working. Where is his climate plan?
The honourable member from Dufferin-Caledon.
The only thing they've achieved is 800,000 Ontarians going to the food bank. Right. Now think about that. That would be the third largest city in all of Ontario, completely dependent upon using the food bank to exist. And according to Feed Ontario's CEO, it used to be that having a job meant you didn't have to access a food bank. But after 8 years of these incompetent Liberals, that's the new reality here in Canada. Why do they care so little about Canadians? Why? Will they axe the tax so Canadians can feed themselves?
The Honourable Minister for Families and Social Development.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. If the Conservatives actually do care about supporting families, their actions last week speak differently, and actions speak louder than words, Mr. Speaker. They voted against much-needed investments to increase access to childcare in underserved communities. They voted against moving forward with a framework to create a national school food policy, putting food back into schools for children who need it. Mr. Speaker, they're just not worth the risk.
The honourable member for Bellechasse, Les Chemins, Lévis. Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Quebecers between the ages of 18 and 45 are seeing their dreams shattered because of inflation. 75% of them are postponing and cancelling major projects such as buying a house or having a child. Unfortunately, they can't count on the costly Bloc Liberal coalition, which wants to radically increase the inflationary carbon tax. So life is impossible for them. Will the Prime Minister listen to our demands and eliminate inflationary taxes and deficits so that Quebecers can finally make their dreams come true, Mr. Speaker? The Honourable Minister for Fisheries and Oceans. Mr. Speaker, I would like to say that it's particularly painful to see my Conservative colleagues from Quebec show that much voluntary blindness. What they defended at the National Assembly to help victims, women victims of violence, to protect other people, is now apparently taboo under the federal leader. They continue to ignore their values, Quebecers, and measures that could help Canadians and Quebecers. It's a complete shambles, a complete shame.
The honourable member for Bellechasse, Les Chemins, Lévis. We'll see who's turning their back on who. We've learned recently that next year a family of four will have to spend an extra $700 on groceries alone. This is the unfortunate consequence of the costly Bloc Liberal coalition and their carbon taxes having a real impact. And this is the largest increase in the price of food in 40 years. Will the Prime Minister finally act so that Quebecers can eat properly, particularly at Christmas? The Honourable Minister of Transport. Quebecers are wondering when, well, this is why the Conservatives voted against dental care. Why did they vote against the Lac Mégantic workaround? What do they have against the Festival of Saint-Tiet?
The honourable member from Winnipeg Centre.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. This government voted to recognize missing and murdered Indigenous women, girls, and Two-Spirit people as a Canada-wide emergency. The Prime Minister acknowledged it as an ongoing genocide. 4 years after the release of the National Inquiry's 231 calls for justice, how many have they completed? Just 2. At this rate, it will take 462 years to implement all of the calls for justice. When will the Liberals start treating this national emergency with the urgency that it deserves?
The honourable minister.
The member for Winnipeg Centre for her question and her continued advocacy. Addressing the ongoing violence against Indigenous women, girls, and 2S LGBTQ+ people is a whole-of-government approach which requires living up to our moral obligations as a country and the calls to justice. That's why in Budget 2023 we've invested $125 million to implement the National Action Plan for MMIWG, ensuring accountability by establishing an oversight mechanism and support the National Family and Survivor Circle. We will continue to work with families, Mr. Speaker, to ensure that the tragedy of missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls are
The honourable member from Timmins, James Bay.
So the Liberals announced legislation for clean water on reserve, but they made no mention of Neskantaga First Nation, which has gone 28 years without access to clean water. At the same time, the leader of the Conservative Party ordered his caucus to try and cut funding for both the suicide hotline and for First Nation clean water. His indifference is deeply disturbing, but it's not surprising. But as for the Liberals, Neskantaga has reached out time and time again. Why is this government continuing to fail the people of Neskantaga First Nation?
The Honourable Minister for Indigenous Services.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And I've been meeting on a quarterly basis with Neskantaga, indeed, to solve the current crisis that Neskantaga has been undergoing. Despite the renovation of their plant, the water is still not testing clean, and we're working together to make sure that happens. In regards to the legislation, as Neskantaga was one of the litigant communities that were deeply involved in the drafting of the regulations, of the legislation, and we look forward to continuing to hear their perspectives.
The Honourable Member for Saint Laurent.
Mr. Speaker, every day approximately 12 people die by suicide in Canada. Each life lost by suicide can have far-reaching effects, whether it's families grappling with the loss of a loved one or the effects that are felt within communities. Last week, I was disappointed to see the Conservatives vote against funding to support the implementation of the new suicide crisis helpline. Can the Minister of Mental Health and Addictions tell us how our government is bringing 988 to Canadians no matter where they live?
The Honourable Minister for Mental Health and Addictions.
I'd like to thank the member for being such a strong advocate for mental health. Mr. Speaker, our hearts go out to all those who have lost a loved one to suicide. And to those struggling with suicidal thoughts, we want to say clearly, we are here for you. You are not alone. Last week, it was despicable to see Conservatives vote against or abstain on funding for the new 988 suicide prevention helpline, including the member for Cariboo Prince George, who abstained on his own motion. Mr. Speaker, Conservatives' risky and reckless behavior has real consequences. On this side of the House, we will not pit mental health against climate change.
The Honourable Member from Foothills.
The Prime Minister's Christmas gift to Canadians is 2 costly carbon taxes, driving up the cost of food, fuel, and home heating. But premiers and First Nations across this country are demanding that he axe a carbon tax because they know that this Prime Minister is not worth the cost. They are joining Conservatives in opposing this punitive carbon tax because Canadians can't afford Christmas dinner. Every month, 2 million Canadians are lined up at food banks because they can't afford to feed their families. When he increases taxes on farmers, those numbers get worse. Will the Prime Minister cancel his plans to quadruple the carbon tax on families, First Nations, and farmers?
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary.
Mr. Speaker, if you want to talk about food affordability, we should talk about Ukraine as the breadbasket to the world. And what I found interesting, Mr. Speaker, and something that the Leader of the Opposition said today in response to the Prime Minister calling out the Conservatives' vote against Ukraine, is he used the term about faraway lands. And Mr. Speaker, that reminded me of something. Quote, "We will no longer use American military might to construct democracies in faraway lands." Donald Trump said that. Why are conservatives repeating the MAGA lines?
The honourable member from Foothills.
Well, it's Merry Christmas, Speaker. I guess the member opposite doesn't realize what country she's in. But the Merry Christmas gift from this Prime Minister to farmers is what? $1 billion carbon tax bill in their stocking, quadrupling that carbon tax under the tree. And the gift from the Prime Minister's Liberal loyalists in the Senate is to cancel Bill C-234, preventing a carbon tax carve-out for farmers. When we have 2 million Canadians lined up at a food bank every month, and those numbers only getting worse when you increase taxes on farmers, why was the Prime Minister cancelling Christmas instead of cancelling this quadrupling of his carbon tax on farmers, families, and First Nations?
The Honourable Deputy Prime Minister and Minister of Finance.
Mr. Speaker, the Conservative leader inadvertently showed his true colors a moment ago. He couldn't bring himself to say the word Ukraine, so instead he dismissively called it a faraway land. You know who notoriously used that term? Neville Chamberlain. In 1938, when he infamously described Germany's invasion of Czechoslovakia as a quarrel in a faraway country between people of whom we know nothing. Shame on them for using the language of appeasement and isolation. Hear, hear.
The honourable member from Calgary, Mindapore.
After 8 years of this Liberal NDP government, it's evident Canadians despise the carbon tax. Premiers are suing this government, First Nations are taking the government to court, and people are lined up at food banks because they can't afford this Prime Minister's inflationary carbon tax. This Prime Minister has ruined Christmas for Canadians by keeping his punitive carbon tax that raises the price of food we buy. This Prime Minister is not worth the cost of the lost hope Canadians should feel around the holidays. So will the Prime Minister cancel his plan to quadruple the tax on families, First Nations, and farmers for good?
The Honourable Minister.
Mr. Speaker, I'm sure that as the holiday season approaches, the Conservative members in this House thought that Christmas was coming early, because it seems that Tucker Carlson is coming to Calgary to host Danielle Smith. And that doesn't stop there, Mr. Speaker. It's going to be Rex Murphy, Tucker Carlson, and Conrad Black in Edmonton just after. The question, Mr. Speaker, is will that member pay for her ticket individually, or is there a group discount for Conservative MPs?
The honourable member from Calgary, Mindapore.
Albertan can stand with Albertans and stop gaslighting Canadians. Yesterday, CTV reported that basic necessities cost more in Calgary than any other major Canadian city. One Calgarian said it's really difficult if you're sacrificing your own meals so your children can eat because grocery prices are unaffordable, or if you're rationing up things like heat for your home. After 8 years of this Liberal NDP government, families are struggling to meet their basic needs, feed themselves, or heat their homes because of this cruel carbon tax. Will the Prime Minister cancel his carbon tax, or will he continue his plan to ruin Christmas for all Albertans and all Canadians?
The Honourable Minister for Workforce Development.
Mr. Speaker, that member has clearly found her voice today, but it has been months that she and the Alberta Conservatives have been silent on defending Albertans when it comes to Danielle Smith's risky and reckless approach to taking Albertans out of the CPP. Maybe she agrees with her leader that Ukraine is some far-flung foreign land. Mr. Speaker, Ukraine matters to Canadians, it matters to Albertans, it matters to Ukrainian Canadians. They and she should be ashamed.
The honourable member for Lac-Saint-Jean. There's movement on the issue of the $460 million that the federal government must reimburse Quebecers for asylum seekers. Yesterday, the minister confirmed that the ball is now in the court of his colleague, the Minister of Finance. So we're questioning her today. There's some information she may not be aware of. First of all, asylum seekers are federal responsibility, and yet Quebec takes in 48% of Canada's asylum seekers at the expense of Quebecers with no help from the provinces. In short, we've done all the work and we pay all the bills. will she reimburse Quebecers? The Honourable Minister of Immigration. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I think the member will be sorry to learn we have a good relationship with Quebec. Last week, we spoke reasonably with Quebec in terms of reasonable immigration, and there's a Quebec-Canada Accord that grants millions to Quebec to welcome immigrants, particularly those who speak French. Asylum seekers is shared jurisdiction, and that's why we work together, because it's a challenge for all our societies in Western worlds. Canada and Quebec are ready to rise to the challenge. The Honourable Member for Lac-Saint-Jean. So we're talking to the Minister of Finance, because right now the Minister of Immigration is the problem. He's the one preventing the file from being settled. So we're talking like serious people. Quebec takes in only 40% of Canada's asylum seekers and pays 100% of the bill. The minister can see that this isn't fair. Quebec just wants everyone to do their fair share. So the Minister of Finance do her fair share, get rid of the Minister of Immigration on this file, and reimburse Quebec. The Honourable Minister of Immigration. Allow the Bloc the time to protest. I think they can also listen to my answer as well. First, I'd like to thank the member for the efforts to reformulate his question. I'll give them the same answer since while we're at it. Quebec does not just write a blank check to provinces. We have reasonable conversations, and I look forward to having future conversations. Thank you.
From Cumberland, Colchester.
Mr. Speaker, Canadian premiers and First Nations are suing the federal government over their unjust carbon tax, and Canadians cannot afford to eat, heat, or house themselves. After 8 years of this NDP Liberal government, indeed, it is a weary world. Back home, there are over 1,800 people on the roster for our local food bank, and over 2 million Canadians across this great country are visiting their local food banks so they can afford to eat. The Prime Minister is not worth the cost. On behalf of all Canadians, will the Prime Minister cancel his plan to quadruple his tax on families, First Nations, and farmers?
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary.
Interesting that the member opposite brings up the misery in the world, and part of that is what Ukrainians are facing right now, defending their democracy. Let me read from Trump's America First. It says, "We will no longer use American military might to construct democracies in faraway lands or try to rebuild other countries in our own image." Mr. Speaker, is that why Conservatives vote against Canada-Ukraine Free Trade Agreement? Because they are taking their lessons from Donald Trump and don't support the rebuilding of Ukraine and democracies around this world.
The Honourable Member for Cumberland, Colchester.
Well, Mr. Speaker, clearly, according to that member, Canadians have never had it so good. Sadly, every day we hear from Canadians who are selling their homes because they cannot afford their mortgages, who are visiting food banks because they cannot afford to eat, and who are spending most of the day in bed with the covers pulled up because they cannot afford home heating fuel. After 8 years of this NDP Liberal government, this is the situation for Canadians in our great country. This Prime Minister and that member is not worth the cost. Once again, on behalf of all Canadians, will the Prime Minister cancel his plan to quadruple the tax on families, First Nations, and farmers forever?
The Honourable Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. You know, I love to see another member from Atlantic Canada stand up because, again, he voted against a COVID funding last week. And also, Mr. Speaker, does he not realize that that's jobs? That's communities. That was 95 projects in his riding with over $16 million. That's in jobs, growing the economy. That's putting food on people's table. That's what we do on this side of the House, Mr. Speaker. We support business, we support people, and help them through these trying times.
The Honourable Member from Costa Bay Central, Notre Dame.
Mr. Speaker, I'll tell you what she supports. She supports seals and rivers. She didn't vote for C-251. You know what, Mr. Speaker? Food bank usage at Memorial University and St. John's has nearly tripled since last year. Grocery increased. Students and families can't afford them thanks to carbon tax. Christmas is not far away and many folks can't afford Christmas dinner this year. After 8 years, this NDP Liberal government is not worth the cost. So will the Prime Minister cancel his plan to quadruple tax on families, First Nations and farmers?
The Honourable Minister for Agriculture and Agri-Food.
Sadly, Mr. Speaker, the official opposition voted against all agricultural programs last Thursday evening. But again, they showed their true colours on how they feel about Atlantic Canada and Prince Edward Island when they voted against the funding for the replacement vessel for the Wood Islands Caribou Ferry Service, a vital link between Prince Edward Island and Nova Scotia. I can assure Prince Edward Islanders and Nova Scotians that this government will continue to support a two-vessel system for that vitally important service. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. There we go.
The Honourable Member from Châteauguay-Lacolle.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question is for the Deputy Prime Minister and Minister of Finance. The government has a plan for the middle class, services and programs for our country. Last week, the Conservatives tried to cut programs, and they showed their true colors by voting against programs and services that all Canadians depend on. Thankfully for Canada, they failed their attempt. The Deputy Prime Minister and Minister of Finance, can she tell Canadians about our plan? The Honourable Deputy Prime Minister and Minister of Finance. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Last week, the Conservatives showed their true colours. For 24 hours, the Conservative leader and his entire party voted in favour of cutting our plan to support and grow the middle class. They voted against the Canadian Dental Care Plan. They voted against building houses. They voted against funding our child care plan for $10 a day. They even voted against
from Cypress Hills Grasslands.
Well, after 8 years of this Liberal NDP government, the cost of taking over the family farm is becoming insurmountable. A family in Elrose passed their family farm down to the next generation. And over the last year, the carbon tax on natural gas alone has cost this young family over $3,000. And the Prime Minister's Christmas gift to them is to quadruple the carbon tax. This is just insane. Since the Prime Minister won't axe the tax before Christmas, does he truly believe a new generation of farmers should pay these ridiculous costs, or has making farming unaffordable been his goal all along?
The Honourable Minister.
Mr. Speaker, are we meant to believe that the other side of the House, in their zeal to vote against a carbon tax that they see as harming farmers, that they would vote against all funding for Canada's poultry, egg, and dairy farmers? Is that a way to support farmers? Is the way to support First Nations to cut all housing for new housing on reserve for First Nations? Is a way to help families to cut affordable child care and affordable dental care? No one believes them, Mr. Speaker. No one believes them.
The Honourable Member from Battleford's Lloydminster.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. This Christmas, Canadians are shouldering the weight of this NDP Liberal government's costly carbon tax. Every gift under the tree, every family visit, and every meal prepared will come at an additional cost. The Prime Minister's punishing carbon tax is ruining Christmas. After 8 years of this NDP Liberal government, Canadian families are tired of making the unimaginable sacrifices. This NDP Liberal government is not worth the cost. Mr. Speaker, will the Prime Minister allow his heart to grow 3 sizes and axe the carbon tax on families, First Nations, and farmers?
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of the Environment.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I appreciate the question from my honourable colleague, but Canadians have some questions for that party after their leader's $2 million temper tantrum last week. So those questions include, since an average family of 4 in Ontario receives more than $300 back from the Climate Action Incentive, why are the Conservatives so hell-bent on taking money out of lower and middle-income Canadian families? The second question is, why are they so hell-bent on betraying Ukraine, Mr. Speaker? And my third question for the member from Battleford's Lloydminster is why she's so against the 5 farms in her riding that received over $120,000 in climate action rebates.
The Honourable Member for Charlesbourg-Haut-Saint-Charles. Mr. Speaker, the CEO of CBC is completely out of touch. A month ago, she hired a Paris firm to translate a podcast instead of hiring Quebecers because she didn't like the Quebec accent. Now, when hundreds of employees are wondering if they still have a job after Christmas, she decides it's time to go have some fun in Australia. Does the Minister of Heritage still trust the CBC CEO, Catherine Tate, to run Radio Canada? The Honourable Minister. Mr. Speaker, I'd like to thank my colleague for his question because it allows me to remind everyone here in this chamber and all Quebecers that the last time the Conservative Party was in power, they made cuts to CBC Radio Canada, and their future was in peril. They want to destroy CBC now, even saying that it was as if it were doable. The Conservatives can say whatever they want. They no longer want a public broadcaster. They want to undermine Canadian democracy. It's shameful.
The Honourable Member from Aurora Oak Ridges, Richmond Hill.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. We know that governments that have strong representation by women and strong women leaders invest more in people. And so, just last week, we saw the Conservatives, whose caucus is only 17% women and lacks diverse representation, oppose program after program that invests in Canadians. In fact, they voted 120 times no to investing in Canadians. Could the President of the Treasury Board share with us how these reckless Conservatives would have greatly hurt the very Canadians we are working so hard to support?
The Honourable President of the Treasury Board.
Mr. Speaker, last week, parliamentarians voted on 120 measures to support Canadians, especially vulnerable Canadians. These included supports to the Canadian Armed Forces, supports for families for affordable childcare, as well as supports for more affordable housing. Canadians deserve opportunities to succeed. Yet on 120 occasions, Conservatives voted against Canadians. We will stand shoulder to shoulder with Canadians every single time, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Member from Edmonton, Griesbach.
By 2026, nearly 60,000 households in Edmonton will live in unsuitable housing or can't afford rent to this government's failure to build affordable homes. Corporate Conservatives and delay Liberals continue to play cover for rich developers and billionaires as they renovate my constituents. Last year, 156 people died in Edmonton because they were homeless. Deaths that could have been prevented had the government acted sooner. So again, when will the government get the money out the door to build social and co-op housing now?
And I ask the Honourable Member from Battle River, Crowfoot, please to wait his turn to ask a question. The Honourable Minister for Housing, Infrastructure and Communities.
Mr. Speaker, I thank my honourable colleague for his question and for his advocacy to continue to invest in affordable housing, including cooperative housing. I would point him to the recent fall economic statement, which increased grant funding to cooperative housing by more than $300 million, and we will be rolling out a program worth more than $1.5 billion beginning early in the new year. Mr. Speaker, I do agree with him on one point of his question, however, the Conservatives' dedication to opposing funding for affordable housing. In fact, just last week when they had an opportunity to put their position on the record in this chamber, they voted against supports for affordable housing. They voted against emergency transition shelters for women and children, and they voted against supports for veterans living through homelessness. Mr. Speaker, it's the wrong.
The Honourable Member from Nanaimo, Ladysmith.
More than 800,000 herring were killed because of open net fish farm activity. Now, the BC Premier says the social...
I'm going to interrupt the member from Nanaimo, Ladysmith, because we can't hear her in the House. We can? So I'll just ask you to start again from the top, the Honourable Member from Nanaimo, Ladysmith.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Open net fish farms pollute our waters and impact food security. In 2022 alone, more than 800,000 herring were killed because of open net fish farm activity. Now, the BC Premier says the social license for these fish farms has expired. The Liberals promised to get these farms out of the water by 2025 with a real jobs plan, yet so far, nothing. So I will ask again, where is the plan so that coastal communities, workers, and First Nations are not left behind?
The Honourable Minister for l'Honorable Ministre des Pêches et Océans.
The Honourable Minister for Fisheries and Oceans.
Is committed to developing a responsible transition plan for open net aquaculture. We continue to work on a transition plan that protects Pacific salmon while providing support to workers and their communities and advancing reconciliation. Fishery and Oceans Canada, along with my office, continue to have constructive conversations with stakeholders regarding next steps. Thank you.
That brings to an end oral questions. I recognize the honourable member from Humber River Black Creek, who is rising on a point of order.
Mr. Speaker, there have been discussions amongst the parties, and if you seek it, I hope you will find unanimous consent to adopt the following motion. Whereas Jimmy Lai stands for so many of the values championed by Canadians, most importantly media freedom, respect for the rule of law, and standing up for what is right. Whereas Mr. Lai is a peaceful pro-democracy campaigner and publisher whose hugely popular newspaper, Apple Daily, was shut down for political reasons in 2021. Whereas Mr. Lai has just spent his 76th birthday in prison, where he has been for the last 3 years on charges brought under the National Security Law, whose provisions are inconsistent with international human rights law. Whereas Mr. Lai is about to face trial on yet further charges arising from his pro-democracy writing and campaigning that could see him spend the rest of his life behind bars. Therefore, the House resolves to call upon the Hong Kong authorities to release Jimmy Lai and cease prosecuting him and others charged under the national security law, and the House reaffirms journalists and media workers everywhere have the right to operate in an environment free from intimidation and harassment by state authorities. Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker.
All those opposed to the honourable member moving the motion will please say nay. Agreed. The House has heard the terms of the motion. All those opposed to the motion will please say nay. Carried. I also see the honourable member from Sarnia-Lambton rising on a point of order.
Great job. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Today is Christmas on the Hill, and there have been discussions between the parties, and I think if you seek it, you will find unanimous consent for the following: that the House designate December as Christian Heritage Month.
Oh. Hey, unfortunately, I heard a member say no to that request for unanimous consent. I see the government House leader.
She may not be. We weren't sure.
Okay. Of order, the honourable member from Yorkton Melville.
Thank you so much, Speaker. And I just want to draw attention to the fact that those responses on the other side of the House today made Canadians feel very blue because they know we voted non-confidence in this government. Thank you.
Not certain if that's a point of order, but I thank the honourable member. It being 3:17, the House will now proceed to the taking of the deferred recorded division on the motion to concur in the 12th report of the Standing Committee on Justice and Human Rights. Call in the members.
I guess we're just waiting now.
anyone that's just joining us and have been to the channel before and you would like to support the channel, you can do so by hitting the like, subscribe, or you can do it by a donation through a super chat or sticker.
The question is as follows. Mr. Genuis, seconded by Mr. Scheer, moved that the 12th report on the Standing Committee on Justice and Human Rights, presented on Monday, June 5, 2023, be concurred in. The 10-minute period for members voting electronically has started, and the House will now proceed to the vote for members participating in person. All those in favor of the motion will please rise.
Mr. Schmale.
Mr. Schmale.
Mr. Ellis.
Mr. Ellis.
Mr. Kimmich.
Mr. Kimmich.
Mr. Perkins.
Mr. Perkins.
Mrs. Thomas.
Mrs. Thomas.
Monsieur Paulus.
Monsieur Paulus.
Mr. Halland.
Mr. Halland.
Miss Lewis Haldeman Norfolk.
Ms. Lewis Haldeman Norfolk.
Mrs. Gray.
Mrs. Gray.
Mr. Moore.
Mr. Moore.
Mr. Kelly.
Mr. Kelly.
Mr. Baldinelli.
Mr. Baldinelli.
Mr. Cooper.
Mr. Cooper.
Mr. Hoback.
Mr. Hoback.
Mr. Lewis Essex.
Mr. Lewis Essex.
Mr. Jennis.
Mr. Jennis.
Mr. Small.
Mr. Small.
Mr. Bazan.
Mr. Bazan.
Mr. Duncan Stormont Dundas South Calgary.
Mr. Duncan Stormont Dundas South Calgary.
Monsieur Berthold.
Monsieur Berthold.
Mr. Workington.
Mr. Workington.
Mr. Chong.
Mr. Chong.
Mr. Abultayev.
Mr. Abultayev.
Mrs. Kuzi.
Mrs. Kuzi.
Mr. Seaback.
Mr. Seaback.
Miss Ferrari.
Miss Ferrari.
Mr. Stewart.
Mr. Stewart.
Mr. Davidson.
Mr. Davidson.
Mr. Viss.
Mr. Viss.
Mr. Doherty.
Mr. Doherty.
Mr. Macaulay Edmonton West.
Mr. Macaulay Edmonton West.
Mr. Lloyd.
Mr. Lloyd.
Monsieur Brassard.
Mr. Brassard.
Mrs. Vecchio.
Mrs. Vecchio.
Monsieur Godin.
Monsieur Godin.
Madame Vien.
Madame Vien.
Mrs. Roberts.
Mrs. Roberts.
Mr. Williams.
Mr. Williams.
Mr. Malillo.
Mr. Malillo.
Mr. Tucker.
Mr. Tucker.
Miss Gladue.
Miss Gladue.
Mrs. Cramp Nyman.
Mrs. Cramp Nyman.
Mr. Zimmer.
Mr. Zimmer.
Mr. Patzer.
Mr. Patzer.
Mr. Lobb.
Mr. Lobb.
Mr. Kitchen.
Mr. Kitchen.
Mr. Muse.
Mr. Muse.
Mr. Redikoff.
Mr. Redikoff.
Mr. Van Popta.
Mr. Van Popta.
Mr. Waugh.
Mr. Waugh.
Mr. Steinley.
Mr. Steinley.
Monsieur Leroux.
Monsieur Leroux.
Monsieur Généreux.
Monsieur Généreux.
Mr. Morant.
Mr. Morant.
Mr. Mazer.
Mr. Mazer.
Mrs. Falk Battlefords Lloydminster.
Mrs. Falk Battlefords Lloydminster.
Monsieur Martel.
Monsieur Martel.
Monsieur Gould.
Monsieur Gould.
Mr. Couric.
Mr. Couric.
Mrs. Gallant.
Mrs. Gallant.
Mr. Caputo.
Mr. Caputo.
Mr. Vidal.
Mr. Vidal.
Mr. Cram.
Mr. Cram.
Mr. Tolmie.
Mr. Tolmie.
Mrs. Wagenthal.
Mrs. Wagenthal.
Mr. Epp.
Mr. Epp.
Mr. Bragdon.
Mr. Bragdon.
Mr. Allison.
Mr. Allison.
Mr. Dalton.
Mr. Dalton.
Mr. Soroka.
Mr. Soroka.
Mr. McLean.
Mr. McLean.
Mr. Shipley.
Mr. Shipley.
Mr. McGuire.
Mr. McGuire.
Mr. Reed.
Mr. Reed.
Mr. Shields.
Mr. Shields.
Mr. Falk Provencher.
Mr. Falk Provencher.
Mr. Motts.
Mr. Motts.
Mr. Williamson.
Mr. Williamson.
Mr. Arnold.
Mr. Arnold.
Mr. Dowdall.
Mr. Dowdall.
Mr. Albus.
Mr. Albus.
Mr. Carey.
Mr. Carey.
Mr. Vierson.
Mr. Vierson.
Mr. Ruff.
Mr. Ruff.
Mr. Fast.
Mr. Fast.
Mr. Khanna.
Mr. Khanna.
Mr. Leslie.
Mr. Leslie.
Mr. Majumdar.
Mr. Majumdar.
All those opposed?
Monsieur Terrien.
Oh, non.
Désolé, mais pour continuer, pour tous ceux qui sont en faveur.
We will continue with all those who are in favor.
Monsieur Terrien.
Monsieur Terrien.
Monsieur Bergeron.
Monsieur Bergeron.
Monsieur Thériault.
Monsieur Thériault.
Madame Larouche.
Madame Larouche.
Madame Posé.
Madame Posé.
Monsieur Beaulieu.
Monsieur Beaulieu.
Madame Saint-Clair-Desgagnés.
Madame Saint-Clair-Desgagnés.
Madame Chabot.
Madame Chabot.
Madame Desbiens.
Madame Desbiens.
Monsieur Desilets.
Monsieur Desilets.
Mr. Julian.
Mr. Julian.
Miss Kwan.
Miss Kwan.
Mr. Garrison.
Mr. Garrison.
Miss Blaney.
Miss Blaney.
Miss Idlout.
Miss Idlout.
Mr. Cannings.
Mr. Canning.
Mr. Johns.
Mr. Johns.
Mr. McGregor.
Mr. McGregor.
Miss Gazan.
Miss Gazan.
Madame Hughes.
Madame Hughes.
Monsieur Bouleris.
Monsieur Bouleris.
Mr. Angus.
Mr. Angus.
Mr. Davies.
Mr. Davies.
Miss Matheson.
Miss Matheson.
Mr. Desjardins.
Mr. Desjardins.
Miss McPherson.
Miss McPherson.
Mr. Blakey.
Mr. Blakey.
Mr. Morris.
Mr. Morris.
Miss Gould.
Miss Gould.
Mr. Sajan.
Mr. Sajan.
Mr. Blair.
Mr. Blair.
Mr. O'Regan.
Mr. O'Regan.
Miss Ing.
Miss Ing.
Monsieur Rodriguez.
Mr. Rodriguez.
Miss Anand.
Miss Anand.
Mr. Wilkinson.
Mr. Wilkinson.
Miss Sachs.
Miss Sachs.
Miss Suds.
Miss Suds.
Miss Bennett.
Miss Bennett.
Miss Murray.
Miss Murray.
Miss Scroll.
Miss Scroll.
Mr. Scarpalegia.
Mr. Scarpalegia.
Mr. Casey.
Mr. Casey.
Miss Cara.
Miss Cara.
Madame Saint-Onge.
Madame Saint-Onge.
Miss Haidu.
Miss Haidu.
Monsieur McKinnon Gatineau.
Mr. McKinnon Gatineau.
Miss Ian.
Miss Ian.
Mr. Ananda Sangari.
Mr. Ananda Sangari.
Madame Martinez Farada.
Madame Martinez Farada.
Mrs. Valdez.
Mrs. Valdez.
Mr. Mandicino.
Mr. Mandicino.
Miss Jazek.
Miss Jazek.
Monsieur Lametti.
Monsieur Lametti.
Monsieur Dubourg.
Monsieur Dubourg.
Monsieur Arsenault.
Monsieur Arsenault.
Miss Jones.
Miss Jones.
Miss O'Connell.
Miss O'Connell.
Mr. Oliphant.
Mr. Oliphant.
Mr. Lamoureux.
Mr. Lamoureux.
Miss Sahota.
Miss Sahota.
Madame Bendayan.
Madame Bendayan.
Mr. Fragiscados.
Mr. Fragiscados.
Mr. Biddle.
Mr. Biddle.
Mr. Bruson.
Mr. Bruson.
Mr. Vancouverden.
Mr. Vancouverden.
Monsieur Lauzon.
Monsieur Lauzon.
Mr. Kuzmarchuk.
Mr. Kuzmarchuk.
Mr. Assassi.
Mr. Assassi.
Monsieur El Khoury.
Monsieur El Khoury.
Mr. Fillmore.
Mr. Fillmore.
Mr. Fonseca.
Mr. Fonseca.
Mr. Hardy.
Mr. Hardy.
Mr. Housefather.
Mr. Housefather.
Mr. Cedar Brampton East.
Mr. Cedar Brampton East.
Mr. Badaway.
Mr. Badaway.
Mr. Sousa.
Mr. Sousa.
Mr. Duguid.
Mr. Duguid.
Mrs. Atwin.
Mrs. Atwin.
Mr. Maloney.
Mr. Maloney.
Mr. Sarai.
Mr. Sarai.
Mr. Callaway.
Mr. Callaway.
Monsieur Sanson.
Monsieur Sanson.
Monsieur Serré.
Monsieur Serré.
Madame Koutrakis.
Madame Koutrakis.
Madame Brière.
Madame Brière.
Mr. Fisher.
Mr. Fisher.
Mr. May Cambridge.
Mr. May Cambridge.
Monsieur Yakono.
Monsieur Yakano.
Mr. Johari.
Mr. Johari.
Mr. Long.
Mr. Long.
Mr. Longfield.
Mr. Longfield.
Mr. Morrissey.
Mr. Morrissey.
Miss Hefner.
Miss Hefner.
Mr. Chang.
Mr. Chang.
Madame Shanahan.
Madame Shanahan.
Miss Cedar Brampton South.
Miss Cedar Brampton South.
Mr. Sobera.
Mr. Sobera.
Madame Lambropoulos.
Madame Lambropoulos.
Mr. Rogers.
Mr. Rogers.
Miss Yip.
Miss Yip.
Madame Mendez.
Madame Mendez.
Mr. Louis Kitchener-Conestoga.
Mr. Louis Kitchener-Conestoga.
Mr. Van Bynen.
Mr. Van Bynen.
Mr. Weiler.
Mr. Weiler.
Mr. Baines.
Mr. Baines.
Miss Bradford.
Miss Bradford.
Mr. Collins Hamilton East Stony Creek.
Mr. Collins Hamilton East Stony Creek.
Mr. Koto.
Mr. Koto.
Madame Diab.
Madame Diab.
Mr. Gahir.
Mr. Gahir.
Miss Kayabaga.
Miss Kayabaga.
Madame Lapointe.
Madame Lapointe.
Mr. McDonald Malpec.
Mr. McDonald Malpec.
Mr. Meow.
Mr. Meow.
Miss Thompson.
Miss Thompson.
Well, Vern, and that would make her related to Fidel.
All those opposed to the motion will please rise. The House will now wait for the electronic voting period to end before resuming its proceedings.
All right, now it's going to be a couple minutes before this is done. That was a pretty intense start to question period. It's been a wild day, actually. I mean, today started off pretty bumpy, too, between Kevin and the Conservatives. Kevin not shutting up. So it's been one heck of a day to be airing this on YouTube. Anyone who hasn't done it already, go ahead and give a like and subscribe to help support the channel. Yeah, Trudeau's pissed. Have you seen his polling numbers? Not so good. They're voting on something to do with the Taliban and human rights. It's a standing committee. Well, I think Canadians are getting to the breaking point now, so it won't be long before either Justin Trudeau steps down or people make him step down, because it's getting... people really get fed up now. And then grocery prices are supposed to go up again coming into the new year, and that's... people can't afford to eat as it is. You know, the supply even for food banks is going to start getting scarce. And then when the starvation starts, I think that's going to be a huge issue for Trudeau leading into any future elections if it makes it that far. If Trudeau was to step down, then it would be the Deputy Prime Minister, which is Chrystia Freeland, would be next in line. And God forbid she ever gets in. She's a demon. I wouldn't let her run a popsicle stand. Just think about it, though. You have a drama teacher as your prime minister. Your deputy prime minister is a freelance journalist. Like, none of these people are really qualified to even be in their positions.
Je désire informer la Chambre que la période de...
I wish to inform the House that the electronic voting period has ended. If members were not able to vote due to technical difficulties, they may now use the raise hand function and the chair will recognize them.
Le bureau va maintenant...
The table will now compile the results of the vote.
Yeas pour 324, 324. Nays contre, 0, aucun.
Je déclare la motion adoptée.
I declare the motion carried.
I wish to inform the House that because of the deferred recorded divisions, government orders will be extended by 12 minutes. I am now ready to provide the House with an explanatory ruling on the admissibility of Ways and Means Motion number 19. On November 29, 2023, I ruled that the order for consideration of the motion and the subsequent bill based thereon be allowed to proceed further. On November 28, 2023, the House Leader of the official opposition had challenged the admissibility of the motion. He pointed out that Bill C-318, an act to amend the Employment Insurance Act and the Labour Code Canada, adoptive and intended parents, and Bill C-323, an act to amend the excise tax, mental health services, both currently in committee, were substantially the same as provisions covered in Ways and Means Motion number 19, tabled earlier that day. L'adoption d'une motion. Order. L'adoption d'une motion.
The adoption of a Ways and Means motion constitutes an order to table a bill based on the provisions of the motion. In this case, Bill C-59 and this bill, C-59, is regarding to some provisions of the budget tabled in Parliament on March 28, 2023.
That the two private members' bills had already been the subject of decisions of the House at second reading. The Ways and Means motion and Bill C-59 would violate a procedural concept, the rule of anticipation, which he described as, and I quote, the same question rule. Quoting from House of Commons Procedure and Practice, 3rd edition, at page 568, the members seem to suggest that a Ways and Means motion could not anticipate a matter already standing on the order paper and which was contained in another form of proceeding. He asserted that Bills C-318 and C-323 were more effective tools to accomplish the desired intent than Ways and Means Motion number 19. As such, both these bills should have priority over the motion. Le député a également mentionné
The member also mentioned precedents having to do with bills based on the underlying principle that states that the House cannot make a decision twice in the same session on the same matter. The member then stated, given the rule that prevents us from anticipating that we suspend Ways and Means Motion 19 while waiting to see what becomes of Bills C-318 and Bill 323.
The Secretary to the Government House Leader countered that further consideration of Ways and Means Motion number 19 and subsequent proceedings on an associated bill was in order. He referenced past precedents about similar bills. He made the point that the provisions in Ways and Means Motion number 19 contained numerous elements that are not found in Bill C-318 and C-323, which indicates that the principle and scope of the Ways and Means Motion are broader than what is found in either of the bills. As such, Ways and Means Motion number 19 and the bills based thereon constituted different questions. Lors de son intervention, le leader
The opposition House Leader quoted page 568 of House of Commons Procedures and Practice, 3rd edition. The chair would like to read the passage on the same page before the extract in question, which says, at a certain time, presenting a motion was under this rule, which is no longer strictly observed.
The rule of anticipation is part of the standing orders of the British House of Commons. It has never been so in the Canadian House of Commons. Furthermore, references to past attempts to apply this British rule to Canadian practice are inconclusive. Unquote. Bien que l'interdiction d'anticiper.
Even though the notion of anticipation is described in our procedural authorities, and the expression is sometimes colloquially used in points of order, and even some past rulings dealing with similar items, it is indeed a very difficult concept to apply in our context.
Établir une hiérarchie entre les projets de loi et des motions, ou
Establishing a hierarchy between bills and motions, or between categories of bills and giving precedence to some, may prove difficult. Except in very specific cases detailed in House of Commons Procedure and Practice. Bills and motions are different by nature and achieve different ends.
What the chair is seized with in reviewing the current matter is the rule forbidding the same question from being decided twice in the same session. It is different from the concept of anticipation and, in the view of the chair, the one that should apply. In his submission, the House Leader of the official opposition cited various recent precedents, and the chair thinks it pertinent to describe some of their procedural subtleties. Le premier exemple, qui remonte à la législature précédente, concernait deux mesures.
The first example from the last Parliament pertained to two bills, not identical but substantially similar. Bill C-218, an act to amend the Criminal Code Sports Betting, a private member's bill, and Bill C-13, an act to amend the Criminal Code Single Event Sport Betting, a government bill. Both were at the second reading, and both were very short bills touching the same section of the Criminal Code.
Dans le projet de loi,
by adopting C-218 at second reading, the House had agreed to the larger principle of repealing the very portion of the Criminal Code that Bill C-13 also sought to amend. This sequencing left the House with a situation where Bill C-13 could not move forward as long as C-218 continued its course.
The second example from earlier this session described a budget implementation bill, Bill C-19, and a votable private member's bill amending the criminal code regarding the promotion of anti-Semitism, Bill C-250. The latter, introduced on February 9, 2022, contained provisions that were subsequently included in Bill C-19, introduced on April 28, 2022. However, of the two bills, the government bill was the first to be adopted at second reading and referred to committee. One of the key differences was that the two bills were not substantially identical. C-19 was much broader in scope than C-250. By agreeing to C-19, the House de facto agreed with the principles presented in C-250. No decision having yet made on Bill C-250, the Chair ordered that it be held as pending business until such time as royal assent be granted to Bill C-19. Finally, the member referenced rulings dealing with two votable private members' bills, business items. Bill C-243, an act respecting the elimination of the use of forced labor and child labor in supply chains, and C-211, an act to enact the Fighting Against Forced Labor and Child Labor in Supply Chains Act and to amend the customs tariff. The two bills had the same objective, and only one was allowed to proceed further. The Chair indicated at the time that the case involved an unusual set of circumstances, since normally one of them could have been designated non-votable by the Subcommittee on Private Members' Business had the sequence of events been different. Le principal argument avancé par le leader à la Chambre.
The House Leader's main argument hinged on the question of whether provisions contained in Ways and Means number 19, and therefore Bill C-59, are similar or identical to Bill C-13 and C-323. Bill C-318 and C-323 have both been read a second time and referred to committee. While no decision has yet been made on Bill C-59.
An exhaustive review of the provisions shows that it does contain some similar provisions found in the two aforementioned private members' bills. However, Bill C-59 cannot be described as substantially similar or identical to them. Its scope is vastly broader, containing many more elements than what is included in Bills C-318 and C-323, including taxation legislation and provisions requiring a royal recommendation.
In part, but are not substantially the same. The principles of C-318 and C-323, as adopted at second reading, are indeed included in the broader C-59, but the reverse is not true. Therefore, the decision the House will take on C-59 will not be the same. Accordingly, there is no procedural reason to stop the bill from continuing its journey through the legislative process. To be clear, when a government bill and a private member's bill, or when two private members' bills are substantially similar, only one of them may proceed and be voted on. Once one of the two has passed second reading, a decision cannot be taken on the other within the same session. Where bills are only similar in part, the effect of adopting one might have a different impact on the other, depending on their principle, scope, and, of course, which bill is adopted first. I note that the House Leader of the official opposition rose earlier today on a different point of order concerning the application of Standing Order 69-1 to Bill C-59. I wish to inform the member and the House that I'm reviewing the matter closely, and I do intend to come back with a ruling in a timely manner. Nonetheless, for the time being, the Chair sees no reason to rule that C-59 be put in abeyance. As for the two private members' business items currently in committee, it seems premature for the Chair to intervene at this time. I thank all members for their attention. Orders of the day.
Ordre du jour, ordre éminent du gouvernement, projet de loi éminent du gouvernement commune.
Government orders, government bills, commons.
Bill C-59, Fall Economic Statement Implementation Act 2023.
Mr. Wilkinson, for Ms. Freeland, seconded by Madame Saint-Onge, moves that Bill C-59, an act to implement certain provisions of the Fall Economic Statement, tabled in Parliament on November